Hello, and thank you for joining me today. Coming up in the news, we have updates on two seaplane crashes that have been in the news. And the Congressional Budget Office has released new calculations on what it would cost if we gave away air traffic control to a new private corporation. And if you ever thought that privatization was a good idea, you're going to be shocked by these numbers. And National Aviation Day is coming up on Saturday, August 19th, so we've got 13 great ideas to share with you on how you can spend the day helping to introduce other people to aviation, or how you can have some new aviation experiences yourself. And by the way, if you listen to this after the August 19th, you can still do these things. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about, you bet, general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to help you get smarter, faster, keep you safe as a pilot or student pilot, because I'm going to share with you my 40 years of experience as a licensed pilot, author of a few books and many magazine articles, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Now, last week we talked about turbochargers and why it's an emergency when they fail. So if you didn't hear episode 25, please check it out. And coming up over Labor Day, Rob Mark will be joining us again. It's going to be the M&R Aviation Joke Hour. Yes, I'm M, he's R, and we're going to have a great time reading jokes that you've sent to us. Now stand by, because the news is next. From AvWeb, the NTSB has completed an investigation of the Icon A5 crash that occurred on May 8 and which took the lives of two Icon employees. Investigators found the probable cause of the accident was the, quote, pilot's failure to maintain clearance from terrain while maneuvering at a low altitude, unquote. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's mistaken entry into a canyon surrounded by steep rising terrain while at a low altitude for reasons that could not be determined. Investigators didn't find any mechanical problems or failure with the aircraft. They did report that in examining the wreckage, they found that the ballistic parachute handle was partially extended and the pin was removed. Now, I've got to tell you, as someone who uses, or not uses, but teaches a lot about the use of ballistic parachutes in the Cirrus, there are minimum altitudes for deploying these parachutes. And the problem is if you deploy it too low, you're going to make things worse, because when the parachute's initially deployed, the aircraft is usually pointed straight down at the ground. So the handle may have been partially extended, but I'm sure the pilot realized that pulling it would be a big mistake, because eyewitnesses said that this aircraft was extremely low just before the accident occurred. Now, I did talk about this accident in previous episodes and also was quoted in the media. I said that this aircraft was a long distance away from the designated seaplane landing zones on Lake Berryessa, and it was in an area that has a lot of obstacles and which I think is very hazardous, and I've always flown fairly high over that area, never been down close to the water. And I just want to mention, in addition to that I had an airline pilot friend of mine who died a couple of years ago in an accident in which he was flying low and hit a wire and unfortunately killed himself and his granddaughter who was with him at the time. Now, a college friend of his told me that pilot liked to, quote, chase cows back when they were in college. All I can say is, people, it's just not worth flying low to get your thrills. Try and do that some other way, because, you may get away with it hundreds of times, but it does catch up with some pilots. And from Flying Magazine, Santa Monica is rushing to shorten the runway at SMO Airport. With the agreement that the city of Santa Monica made with the FAA earlier in the year to shorten the runway, they're going to ultimately close the airport in 2028, but in the meantime, they're working fast to try and shorten the runway to keep jets from being able to land at this airport. This week, City Council approved a contract to shorten the runway from 4,900 feet to 3,500 feet for a maximum guaranteed price of $3.5 million to be paid for by the taxpayers. The new runway distance is going to make it too short for most jet traffic that now flies in and out of this 100-year-old airport. And so the city refers to this as construction, but actually it's destruction. It's set to begin in October. Initially, the work will be done at night, but there will be 7 to 10 days during which the airport will be closed. And the plan is for this work to be completed by the end of the year. And there's more news on privatization. I try not to talk about this every week because I worry that you might tire of it, but sometimes there's just so much news I do have to talk about it. The latest comes from AOPA.org. They say the Congressional Budget Office has revised their cost estimate for the cost of removing air traffic control from the FAA, and they now say that the legislation would create a deficit of almost $100 billion. Now, that's an increase of nearly $80 billion from the previous estimate. Now, think about this. We're going to give away all of these assets, about $56 billion at the original purchase price of the FAA, to a new private corporation. We're going to give away $56 billion. We're going to give them another roughly $6.7 billion in the Aviation Trust Fund to be used as startup money. And it's now going to cost us $100 billion on top of that. I mean, anybody who thinks this is a good idea really ought to re-examine this closely. A number of economists have already voiced their opposition to the legislation, calling it cronyism and saying it is not truly privatization. Max Sawicki, an economist with the Economic Policy Institute, says the proposal was bad business. And yes, if you listened to our show on privatization last month, you know that it really doesn't meet the definition of privatization. They're not selling the assets to the highest bidder. They're just giving it away. So this proposal just looks worse and worse. Now, in a separate story from bjtonline.com, I found an article that says Democratic leaders in the House of Representatives are seeking an investigation into whether some Department of Transportation officials violated lobbying laws in their push to propose privatizing air traffic control. They've asked the DOT Inspector General to investigate whether political appointees violated federal law, including the Anti-Lobbying Act. Now, language in that act prohibits use of government funds for means designed to influence in any manner a member of Congress, a jurisdiction, or any official of any government to favor, adopt, or oppose by vote or otherwise any legislation. But the lawmaker says it's come to their attention that at least 4 political appointees in the Department of Transportation have been contacting members of Congress, non-federal stakeholders such as Aviation Association representatives, so that would be like AOPA and EAA, and airport sponsors to both gain support for the AIR Act, that's the name of this privatization bill. They also point to written materials on a DOT website and official social media accounts on Facebook and Twitter that, quote, have the unambiguous intent of encouraging members of the public to support ATC privatization. And they say even when viewed in the most favorable light, these emails, telephone calls, and other activities are highly irregular at best. And turning to international news, boy, would you know we're still talking about privatization. Every Saudi airport is going to be privatized this year, according to stepfeed.com. Now, I know we have some listeners over there, and it says, in a move aimed at improving quality and service, Saudi Arabia will privatize all of its airports by the end of this year. They say the goal is to, quote, improve the level of services provided to passengers and to convert the targeted sectors into a profitable center to cover cost and to be a source of income for the owner. That comes from the head of the General Authority for Civil Aviation, according to Arab News. Now, with the decline in oil prices over the last few years, the kingdom has been pushed to make major financial reforms, and as a result, Saudi leaders have been looking to privatize government-controlled entities. In fact, even the massive state-owned oil company, so-called Saudi Aramco, is going to be partially privatized. They say that about a 5% stake in the company will become publicly traded, and that they estimate this sale will rake in billions of dollars. And from pilotweb.aero, this story is about the United Kingdom. It says the first 8.33 kilohertz radio grant claims are paid by the CAA. Now, here in the U.S., listeners are going, huh? Let me back up and explain a little bit. Years ago in the United States, we would have a new frequency every 100 kilohertz. So as you dialed your radio, you go from 118.1 to 118.2. And then at some point in time, they decided to split those frequencies as the technology got better, and we were able to fit twice as many voice channels in there. So then it would go from 8.1 to 8.15 to 8.2. And then yet again, there was one more split to create the so-called 720 channel radio. And so we now have a frequency every 25 kilohertz. So it would go from 8.1 to 8.125 to 8.5 to 8.175 and so on. Now, in Europe, they have split things even further, whereas we have 25 kilohertz increments between our frequencies. They've taken that same amount of space and cut it in 3 and put in 3 more frequencies. So that becomes 8.33 kilohertz between every frequency. And the CAA has a plan where they're going to pay for 20% of the cost of replacing these radios in aircraft and for replacing the handheld radios that people have. And the first 401 billion pounds apparently has been paid out, covering the first 1,072 pilots who have radios that need to be replaced. And you have to wonder, once we get through the 2020 ADSB mandate where pilots in the U.S. have to install new equipment on the airplanes, is it possible that we're going to have 8.33 kilohertz radios mandated here in the United States? And if that happens, boy, pilots are going to be shelling out more money again. And this next story also comes from the UK. It comes from BBC.com. It's about an accident that occurred last year, and it's got an interesting twist to it, so I wanted to share it with you. An airshow pilot was forced to ditch his plane at the Herne Bay Air Show, and when he did, he got wedged into the cockpit because he was wearing the wrong type of life jacket, according to investigators. Now, the plane lost power and crashed when, get this, a balloon fragment lodged into the engine during display. He then ditched into the shallow water off of Herne Bay. He then became trapped in the cockpit and was rescued from the sea by members of the public. Now, during this air show, there was a series of balloons that were released from a boat for the pilot, who was then supposed to try and use his propeller to burst the balloons at an altitude of about 500 feet or so. Now, a fragment of one of those balloons became lodged in the air path of the engine's carburetor, and the plane lost power. The piece of balloon was about 5 centimeters in diameter, and it was found in the airplane's engine. The pilot responded by trying to ditch the aircraft just off the beach, but the main wheels touched the water first, pitching the aircraft forward before it landed upside down in the water. Now, the life jacket, they said, is a type that's worn by sailors, and it's designed to inflate as soon as it comes into contact with the water. Members of the public ran out to the upturned aircraft, and the pilot had been submerged for about 20 seconds, and they say although he was able to unfasten his straps, he found himself trapped in the cockpit with his head close to the seabed and insufficient space to maneuver himself out. Moreover, his automatic life jacket had inflated, and its bulk and buoyancy were pushing him up into the inverted cockpit. So anybody who's out there flying seaplanes, make sure you're using the proper type of safety vest. You don't want one of these marine-type vests that inflates automatically. And finally, this comes to us from iPadPilotNews.com and also an email that just came through from AOPA. Now, the iPadPilotNews.com story says that with little fanfare, AOPA recently released a new app simply titled AOPA. And it sounds like they did that just to go ahead and make sure things were working well before they announced it to the general public, because yesterday came this AOPA email which says AOPA app debuts for iOS and Android. They say stay up to date on the latest aviation news, watch videos, listen to podcasts, and search events right from your mobile device with a new AOPA app available for free in the iTunes and the Google Play stores. They say that members can manage their membership through the app, and non-members can access all the content as a guest or sign up to become a member. And they say that all users can easily connect with AOPA staff through the event using the chat functionality or by phoning or emailing. Now, according to iPadPilotNews.com, they say it looks like all the same articles, videos, and so on that you can find with any web browser are the same ones which are now being delivered to this app. And the only difference really is that it's been formatted and optimized specifically for use on a smartphone. And that, my friends, is the news for this week. Coming up in a moment, we're going to talk about what you can do to introduce other people to flying on National Aviation Day. Plus, listener questions. One listener asked, just what is a temporary restricted area? We'll be right back. And welcome back. Before I start talking about those 13 great things you can do to celebrate National Aviation Day, a few quick updates. Now, on the new Instagram account, that's at Aviation News Talk on Instagram, you can see some photos I've taken while I was out flying. The latest one was posted from Lake Tahoe yesterday. I was up there flying with listeners Jan and Uta Stumpf, who are both pilots. They own and fly a DA-40NG over in Germany. Now, they were visiting the San Francisco Bay Area this week, and both of them wanted to get their first experience flying a Cirrus. So we took a brand new 2017 SR-22 up to South Lake Tahoe. Interestingly, it was just 1.4 hours each way, so total of 2.8 hours. which includes all the time that we spent on the ground. Jan flew on the way up and Uta flew on the way back. We took lots of great pictures. I've only posted one so far, but I'll post some of the others here in the next few days. So go ahead and check out Aviation News Talk on Instagram. And if you're ever here in the San Francisco Bay Area and you want to fly with me on a Cirrus, please get in contact with me. And the survey is still up and running. Thanks for everyone who has gone and filled that out already. For the month of August, we're asking, what flight planning tools do you use when you're planning longer flight plans? And there's also an opportunity for you to go into detail about exactly how you might use multiple tools, what sequence you use them in, what you do when you're planning a flight. And I'm learning from that, and we'll certainly tell you about that sometime next month when the survey is completed. There's also a place for you to put in suggestions for any topics you'd like to hear on this podcast. So to find the survey, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey. Now, this is the part of the show where I talk briefly about a couple of ways you can help support the show. And I want to thank 5 more Patreon supporters, one of whom who pushed us over the top, Richard Dick Geyer, Jimmy, who does the Plain Faith podcast, and Mark Lebrowski. Mark is the one who got us over the top for our August goal to create new apps, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Hamish Keb and George Strohmeyer also just joined us today. So speaking of the Patreon page, just a day or so ago, I posted a rather dramatic video of an air tanker which was fighting a fire in Southern California. And this jet-powered tanker, I couldn't tell what model it was, but it was a large jet. It was just absolutely plunging down the side of a hill as it dropped the bright red fire retardant on a fire near Riverside, California. Now, anybody can see that post. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and click on posts, which is up near the top of the page. And while you're on the page, go ahead and check out our goals and consider supporting the show with a donation by credit card. Now, the second goal that Mark Lebrowski helped us to meet is the development of 2 apps so that non-techie pilots can discover our show in the Apple iTunes Store and the Google Play Store. That's going to make it easier for them to find us and listen to it. And I've started work on it. It looks like we could have those apps available sometime in late September. So thanks so much for helping to make that possible. Now, we're still looking for contributors to help us reach the next goal, which you can read about by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, because you're all awesome listeners. Or just go to the aviationnewstalk.com website, click on the upper left-hand corner, help the show. Now, there's one other way you can help out if you'd like. You can sign up for one or more of my online courses at pilotlearning.com. We have courses on the G1000 for both VFR and IFR operations, and I have a course up there for GPS and WAAS, and that's for folks who are flying the latest fancy GPS approaches, such as WAAS-based approaches, LPVs, LNAV plus Vs, all that stuff. Now, course costs range from $59 to $79 per course, or you can take all of the courses for just a low monthly membership of $29.95, or sign up for an entire year for $299, which is the same as getting 2 free months. And if you sign up for the full year, you'll get a half-hour consulting call with me included as well on any topic you'd like to discuss. And you'll find all of that at pilotlearning.com. Now, stick around, because in 7 seconds, we'll be back with all the fun things you'll want to try on National Aviation Day. Welcome back. Well, the idea for this came in a funny way. I was listening to the School of Podcasting podcast episode this week by Dave Jackson, and he was talking about a calendar that listed different national holidays. And he gave, as an example, National Aviation Day. And he said that Max Flight of Airplane Geeks and Max Trescott of Aviation News Talk might want to consider doing that. So what the heck? We're going to talk about it today. Now, National Aviation Day has been around for more than 75 years, but it probably doesn't get the attention it deserves. Franklin Roosevelt created it back in 1939 with a presidential proclamation. And at the time, they said it was to celebrate the growth and advancements being made in aviation. But I got to tell you, I kind of wonder if maybe it was just a way to start getting more people into aviation, create more pilots at a time when Europe was just starting to enter World War II, and we might have thought that we would need to get more people to fly airplanes in the next few years. Anyway, today we face a very different challenge, which is how to attract more people to aviation at a time when demand for pilots is very high. The airlines are hiring like crazy, but new pilot starts are sharply declining. In fact, even Mesa Airlines started advertising in Australia for pilots to fly in the United States. So my thought is you might want to use National Aviation Day as a way to help get more people interested in aviation, both as an avocation for fun and also as a possible career. So I've come up with 13 ways that you can celebrate today. Now, you don't have to do it on August 19th. You can do it on any day, but just try and get more people involved in aviation. Or these are some ideas for how you can kind of increase your involvement with aviation. So, number one, get someone else involved in aviation. If you're a pilot, and I know many of our listeners are, take somebody for a ride in an airplane, especially somebody you know who has an interest in aviation. And if you have already taken them for a flight before and you know that they're interested in flying and that they have the means to pay for flight training, well, commit yourself to helping them schedule their first flying lesson. So if you know of a good flight instructor or a local flight school, take them down to the airport to meet the instructor or talk to the owner of the local flight school. And then as part of the process, try to get your friend to sit in one or more of the aircraft that he or she might be training in. Assuming, of course, they have different models that are available for training, and try and find out which aircraft that person prefers. So when I'm starting people out, I'll put them into a Cessna 172, a Diamond DA-40, a Cirrus SR-20, and everybody likes something different. And then before you leave the airport, make sure that there's an agreement on the date for the first lesson. Now, after that, you can help them get prepared for the first lesson in various ways. You could lend them your headset, for example, or help them figure out how to order one. You can help them download some free pilot training books. I'll talk about those in a minute. You might also help them buy an online private ground school, like the ones from Sporties or King schools. And that's going to help them learn the many different academic topics they're going to ultimately need to master if they're going to become a pilot. And then periodically during the flight training process, just check in with them and find out how it's going. Take them out to coffee and just find out how they're doing. And everybody has some difficulties and obstacles when they're learning to fly. And so student pilots who have a friend to help mentor them through the process are just much more likely to succeed in getting a pilot's license. So number one, get somebody set up for flying lessons. Number two, if you are a rusty pilot who hasn't flown in a long time, start the process today for getting back into flying now. So, for example, on National Aviation Day, I've read that the Rainier Flight Service and other operators at the Renton, Washington Airport up in Washington State are going to hold a Rusty Pilot seminar from 9 to 12, and they have a free barbecue lunch. So if you happen to be in that area, check that out. Or if you live in a different part of the country, check with AOPA.org to see if there's a Rusty Pilot seminar scheduled near you. And of course, you don't have to go to a seminar to get back into flying. Just call up a flight instructor or a flight school and tell them you want to get back into flying. Now, it may take you several flights to regain your proficiency, but once you've done all the required work, you're going to really love the feeling of accomplishment that you're going to have for having gotten back into the air. And number three, fly in a new airplane type. So 1 year for my birthday, I treated myself to about an hour and a half of dual instruction in a Stearman. Now, these biplanes are absolutely beautiful. They were used for flight training back at the beginning of World War II, and my instructor took me out to the practice area, and he demonstrated loops and rolls, and I was videoing the whole thing. I had a great time. And for me, it also was kind of a small connection between my mother and me, who was alive at the time. And she had always talked about seeing many Stearmans flying overhead when she was a child growing up in the 1930s and 40s in Williamsburg, Virginia. But you don't have to get dual instruction if you want to go fly a Stearman or some other, fun airplane. You can just take a sightseeing flight. There are a number of operators around the country that have fun planes like the Stearman to give sightseeing tours in. So look around and see what you could find. For example, I saw there's a company down in San Diego which has a contest, I think, for kids going on this week to win a ride in one of their Stearmans for their sightseeing tours. So number three, fly in a new aircraft type. Number four, you may want to watch an aviation-themed movie. Now, there are just dozens of great aviation-related films, and with Netflix and all the other online services, you don't have to be limited to watching what's in the local theater or on your television. But don't watch by yourself. Invite over a friend, especially somebody you know who's interested in aviation, but who hasn't yet started flight training. This could be the perfect way to start that conversation and encourage them to finally take that first flying lesson. So number 4, watch an aviation-themed movie. Number 5, fly a flight simulator. Now, this could be virtually any kind of simulator, from something very simple to something very complex, and it's going to depend on who you are and where you are in your aviation career. But this can be fun regardless of whether you're a pilot or not. So if you're not a pilot, or if you are a private pilot and you're thinking about instrument training, go to your local flight school and see what kind of flight simulators they have. Then sign up for an hour or two of instruction in the simulator. Now, flight school simulators are much less expensive than flying an airplane, but they can still be very instructive in many ways. And if you're already an instrument pilot, you might be interested in flying something like a full-motion airline simulator. And I got to do that on a tour at Virgin America. I flew their Airbus A320 simulator, which was cool. Now, there are relatively few of these around, and it might take a day to research and find one of these high-end full-motion simulators, but you're going to have great fun experiencing it. So, number 5, fly a flight simulator. Number 6, if you are a licensed pilot, fly somewhere new. And when you do it, take along someone who you feel might be a good candidate for becoming a pilot. You want to think about planning the flight well so that it's going to be pleasurable for the friend. So, for example, if it's often turbulent in your area in the afternoons, then, well, you might want to try and fly during the morning or maybe in the early evening. But make sure that you have a good headset so that he or she can use it and they don't become fatigued by the low frequency noise and vibration in smaller airplanes, because that could be a turnoff to them. And also encourage your friend to bring their camera, take pictures from the air. You might, for example, as you're on your way to the destination, fly over his or her house, which is always kind of fun to do. And then, since it's going to be a new destination for you, you want to do as much research ahead of time about your airport. So you might even want to call to see if they have any local tips, noise abatement procedures, or other recommendations for flying into this new destination, or for things that you can do once you arrive. For example, you might want to choose an airport that has an aviation museum that's right there on the airport property or nearby. So number 6, fly someplace new. Number 7, visit an aviation museum. Now, this could be a local museum that you drive to from your home, or it might be one further away that you have to fly into. Many aviation museums are offering free admission or free programs for children on National Aviation Day, and I'll list some of those here at the end of the podcast. So number 7, visit an aviation museum. Number 8, fly a radio-controlled airplane. Now, even if you are a certificated pilot, you're going to be amazed at how different it is to fly a model aircraft and how fun and satisfying it can be. But please don't run out to the store, buy a model airplane, and then try to teach yourself how to fly it in a nearby park. I have heard countless stories about a number of people who have done this, and the odds are the plane's going to be destroyed in less than 30 seconds. Now, the best way to learn to fly a model aircraft is under the tutelage of an experienced RC pilot. And the best way to find an experienced RC pilot, search for a local flying club. Now, some of these clubs are holding events as part of National Aviation Day, and they'll give visitors the experience of flying. And the way they can do that safely is they'll use 2 transmitters set up in a buddy box configuration, so the experienced pilot can take over immediately if you have problems controlling the aircraft and it's headed for the ground. A good place to search for RC clubs is through the Academy of Model Aeronautics. At their website, you just type in your zip code and they'll find you a nearby club. I'll put a link to that in the show notes and on Patreon. So number 8, fly a radio-controlled airplane. Number 9, volunteer to help an aviation-related organization. Now, as a pilot, I have over the years spent time with at least 4 different nonprofit aviation organizations. One was with Angel Flight West, which is one of a number of different organizations in the country that match pilots up with people who need help getting to a doctor's appointment for a checkup in a city that would otherwise be a very long drive from their home. For example, I once flew a heart transplant patient who was just fine, but he needed to visit Stanford Hospital for a checkup every quarter. Now, these patients are ambulatory, so they can get in and out of general aviation aircraft with just a minimum of assistance. And the pilots are just responsible for getting them from one airport to another. And the patients, they're responsible for all of their own ground transportation. So I think this is a really awesome way for pilots to use your skills to help others who may be a little bit less fortunate than you are. And many years ago, I also flew volunteer doctors and dentists to Mexico so that they could provide free services to people who lived in underserved areas. These were typically 4-day weekend trips, and we usually had a team in the airplane of about 4 people that included a translator. And once we reached the destination, well, the pilot would assist the teams in minor ways. So I always found that kind of satisfying to help the doctors and dentists where I could. There was just really great camaraderie on the trips, and everybody came back pretty satisfied knowing that they helped make life a little better for some of the 100 or so people that we would help on each trip. And I've also flown teenagers for EAA's Young Eagles program. You probably know about this. The program has flown more than a million kids at airports all across the U.S. And to participate in these free flights, pilots first have to join EAA and then join a local EAA chapter that puts on Young Eagles flights. Now, this is a great way to give lots of kids their first exposure to general aviation, and some of these kids do become inspired to go on and get their pilot certificate. So number 9, volunteer to help an aviation-related organization. Number 10, download and read an aviation book from your local library or from NASA. Now, lots of local libraries these days are offering free ebooks that you can download and read on your Kindle or other ebook reader. The best part about borrowing an ebook is you don't have to go to the library to get it, and they're returned automatically, and you're never going to pay a late fee or a fine. Both NASA and the FAA are offering free ebooks that you can download over the internet, and you'll be surprised at the quality of these books and how many of them there are. So go ahead and have fun on National Aviation Day, relaxing and reading an aviation book. And I'll put links to the FAA and NASA sites in the show notes and also on Patreon. So number 10, download and read an aviation book. Number 11, go airplane spotting. This is great fun to do at both commercial and non-commercial airports. Bring along a friend who's interested in aviation and make sure to bring your cameras too. Then take your best pictures and post them on Facebook and other social media so other people can see them. Now, some airports have really spectacular locations for watching airplanes, and in other airports you may have to kind of hunt around and try and find a good spot yourself. So, for example, in Los Angeles, people are always talking about watching the planes land at LAX while they're eating at the nearby In-N-Out Burger. So if you can't go flying on National Aviation Day, at least go out and have some fun watching airplanes. So number 11, go plane spotting. Number 12, thank somebody who works in the aviation industry. Now, the next time you take an airline flight, just take a moment to stop and thank one or more of the members of the crew. These days, you know the same as I know. You look at the news, and hardly a week goes by when there isn't some crazy story about something awful happening on an airliner. And I really kind of feel for airline crews because increasingly they're dealing with much more contentious passengers. It just can't be fun. So take a moment to let them know that you really appreciate all the things they do to try and help keep you safe. And if you are already a pilot, well, take a moment to thank your flight instructor. Flight instructors are really the backbone of the general aviation industry, but they rarely get the recognition that they deserve. So let your flight instructor know that you really appreciate all the things that he or she does to help keep you as a safe pilot. And don't wait to do this. Years ago, I went back to Pennsylvania and visited my first flight instructor who taught me back in the 1970s. And I'm so grateful that I did it then because a few years later, he died in a car accident. So National Aviation Day is just a great excuse for calling up your flight instructor to say hello and thank them for everything they've done to help you. So number 12, thank someone who works in the aviation industry. Number 13, take an aviation course. If you're a student pilot, well, try and find a local ground school course that you could attend. One good way to locate courses, contact your local flight school, see if they know of one. Or if you're already a pilot, take some of the free online courses that are available at FAAsafety.gov and at AOPA's Aviation Safety Institute. Both of these places have free courses, and you're just bound to find one or more that you're interested in. But I think the real benefit is that taking some of these courses could make you a safer pilot. And with the courses at FAAsafety.gov, if you take 3 or more of those courses, you're already halfway to completing the WINGS program, which you probably know is a substitute for the flight review, or BFR, that pilots need to do with a flight instructor every 2 years. And if you're unfamiliar with the WINGS program, just listen to episode 23 where we talked about it in detail. Or if you're really motivated, and I'm hoping some of you will do this, take the first step toward becoming a flight instructor. You can just download the Fundamentals of Instruction, or the FOI book it's called, from FAA.gov and start preparing for one of the 2 written exams that you'll need to take as part of becoming a CFI. Now, it's a long road. There's lots to do, but why not start on National Aviation Day? Just download the FOI book and get prepared for taking the FOI written exam. So number 13, take an aviation course. Now, I said I would talk about some of the different museums and other places that are holding events on National Aviation Day, so let me run through that list pretty quickly here. So for Saturday, August 19th, 2017, Oakland Aviation Museum, Oakland, California. Kids 12 and under are free with a paid adult admission ticket. And in Dayton, Ohio, the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, located at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, free admission. That's in Dayton, Ohio. And if you happen to be in Dearborn, Michigan, the Henry Ford Museum is going to be free, and that's courtesy of Delta Airlines. So parking, all activities, going to be free on Saturday. In Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, out there on the Outer Banks, going to be events held by the First Flight Society. Everything is apparently free. Going to be flyovers, Coast Guard aircraft, and so on. In Dallas, Texas, at the Frontiers of Flight Museum, it's Open Cockpit Day from 10 to 2, and it's free. They also have a newly opened Braniff Gallery. So that's a legacy airline from many years ago. And this is a restaurant and kind of food bazaar in Los Angeles called The Proud Bird. They've got free activities for kids. For the adults, they have $7 aviation cocktails, but they've got 16 different aircraft around the property as well as multiple interactive aviation exhibits. So that's at The Proud Bird in Los Angeles. And if the Laughlin, Nevada Bullhead International Airport, which is right on the border of Arizona and Nevada, they're going to have free breakfast in the morning. It's sponsored by Signature Flight Support, starts at 8 a.m. And in Hutchinson, Kansas, and this is quite a coincidence because I drove right by this place back in April when I picked up an airplane there, the Cosmosphere. Kids can make their own airplanes, free programs during the day. And in Danville, Indiana, the Black Sheep RC Modelers, that's an RC group, is going to have a display and a lunch raffle, and they'll be helping people learn how to fly RC aircraft. And in Douglas, Georgia, at what they say is the state's most complete World War II flight training base. At the airport there, they'll have a lot of displays, reduced fuel prices for pilots who are flying in, as well as, of course, pilots' favorite thing, hot dogs. So that sounds like fun in Douglas, Georgia. And in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Carolinas Aviation Museum, they're going to have a presentation by someone who was on that Miracle on the Hudson flight that landed in the river. And they'll also have 30-minute simulator sessions for folks who are 18 and under to practice flying a Cessna 182. And closer to home here, Menlo Park, California, the Belhaven Branch Library is going to have a session for kids to make paper airplanes and test them out. And finally, the most creative way to spend National Aviation Day is going to be in Redding, California at Woody's Brewing Company. They're going to have a trivia contest in celebration of National Aviation Day, honoring great pilots who flew those amazing flying machines. Come in, have a cold beer, and enjoy today's food special and test your knowledge on aviation history. Well, that's pretty clever. And those are the ideas for National Aviation Day. Go out, have fun, enjoy our wonderful industry. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback and questions. One listener is having trouble cross-filling flight plans between the two Garmin 430s in his plane. We'll be right back. And a quick thank you to Jeremy, who is a Patreon sponsor and posted a new review on iTunes this week. Thanks so much for your kind words. It's fun to read those. Now, listener feedback. Jim Pittman, who's a Patreon supporter, and Tyson from Utah both wrote in about the same thing, which is another way to open a VFR flight plan. Now, we talked about that in conjunction with a prior episode where we talked about the presidential TFR over New Jersey and the need to have a flight plan on file. So let me read Tyson's email. He says, I'm a student pilot. I recently listened to your podcast regarding how to open a VFR flight plan. He said, I found an easy way to file and open a plan with 1-800-WXBrief.com, which will email you an easy to activate and easy to close link. This makes opening your flight plan easy after run-up while waiting in the runway by clicking the link in your email. It also provides a nice reminder to close your flight plan. So thanks both of you for that. And from Hans in Windsor, California, Hans says, Hi, Max. I received this FAAsafety.gov email regarding temporary restricted areas. Do you know what is meant by certain types of operation? So in it, they say this FAA will soon begin limited use of a temporary restricted area, or TRA, In certain areas, when the types of operations to be conducted there require a TRA, the flight rules that apply to a TRA are the same as a restricted area, which, by the way, means you can't fly into it when it's hot. So you definitely want to be getting flight following. The best FAA resources to view any TRAs coming up or active are the FAA Special Use Airspace website and the Notices to Airmen publication. Please use the following links to access these resources before a flight, and they give this website sua.faa.gov. And unfortunately, Hans, I don't know what these certain types of operations are. It sounds to me like it's something of a very temporary nature, but it's almost certainly something which is hazardous. And so they don't want us flying into these restricted areas. And for whatever reason, they just don't meet the criteria for being a permanent restricted area. And from Alan in Palo Alto, California, who's also a Patreon sponsor, he says, Max, regarding the turbocharging emergencies, he said, I had a question about diagnosing a turbo failure. And that was, of course, something we talked about last week. He says, can one determine more about whether the failure is a hot side or cold side issue from the CDT reading? And just a quick note here, that would be the compressor discharge temperature. And that's the temperature of the air that's downstream of the compressor and upstream of any intercooler. And I should mention, Hans flies an aircraft with an intercooler. I don't think any of the turbocharged aircraft that I have flown have intercoolers. That's a separate device which further cools the air before it goes into the compressor portion of the turbocharger. And that allows you to get even higher power out of the aircraft because the air is that much colder. He says, my thinking is that a cold side leak that's downstrobe of the CDT probe will result in at most only a small decrease in CDT, while a hot side leak or turbo failure result in a much larger drop in CD temperature. And he winds up, I certainly wouldn't want to extend flight with a cold side leak longer than needed, but if one can determine that the problem is a cold side leak, it would be possible to keep flying until reaching a truly suitable airport. Well, yeah, if you can find out definitively that it's a cold side leak, then sure, you probably, note I use the word probably, could extend your flight time a little longer. But that's the problem. You know, often when one thing goes wrong, we just don't know what the other things that may have gone wrong associated with it. So I would encourage people, whenever you have a failure of a turbocharger, get on the ground immediately. It's just not worth the risk that something else may have gone wrong and that things are going to go to heck in a hurry. So if in doubt, get on the ground immediately. And here's a question that came in from Brian. He's a Patreon sponsor from Virginia. He wrote, we have a 2004 Cirrus SR22. He says, for several years, I've been putting my flight plan in Garmin 430 number 1 and use the Garmin menu to cross-fill the plan from 430 number 1 to Garmin 430 number 2. Then in number 2, I select the final destination airport and do a direct to using the direct enter keys. This has always left the active complete flight plan in Garmin number 1, and that is the one the autopilot is following. And the final destination airport shows up in number 2, and I can display that on the PFD, which allows me to be able to see immediately the distance and direction to the final destination. Of late, however, the same set of actions caused the Garmin 430 number 1 to copy the direct to setting from the Garmin 430 number 2 and make that destination the active flight plan course. The entire flight plan is still visible in the Garmin number 1, but the magenta arrow has moved down to the final airport in the Garmin number 1, and the autopilot is flying direct to the same final destination, ignoring all the intermediate waypoints. And my reply to him was, Brian, I think somehow the configuration in the crossfill page in the aux group got changed in your GPS number 2. For the system to operate the way you want, I believe you want both Garmins set to a manual transfer. However, it appears that your number 2 Garmin is set for auto transfer. So you need to go into the aux group, select crossfill, and change the method field from auto to manual. Brian wrote back that yes, that did the trick. And as a way to thank me, he went out and bought not 1, but 4 copies of my Max Trescott's WAAS and GPS instrument flying handbook for himself and his partners that own the aircraft. I had told him before that that book is just loaded with information about the Garmin 430. So if you want to get a copy yourself, just call 800-247-6553. Ask for Max Trescott's WAAS and GPS instrument flying handbook. That's for all of the GPSs with WAAS capability and also a lot of information for the Garmin 430. And here's a question that came in from this month's survey, If you go out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey, we're asking a number of questions, but at the very end, I ask, are there any topics you would like to hear more about on Aviation News Talk? And Matthew said, what do you use to record audio on your flights that you later play back on the podcast? And the answer is simple. I fly with a Lightspeed headset that has a app for the iPhone available called Flight Link. And with Flight Link, I can record everything that I hear in my headset. That includes the radios, air traffic control, the conversation with the other pilot on board. So that's what I use. And I'll plan to go ahead and talk some more at a future time about different ways to record audio and video from inside the cockpit. And a quick reminder, if you'd like to have your question answered on the show, go ahead and send me an email, or better yet, record your voice. Either way, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on the button that says Listener Questions in the upper left, and you can then record a voice that will play on the show here. And if you'd like to see all of my original story notes from this episode and all the other episodes, you can go out to our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And for contributors at the $4 a month level, you'll see all of the original news stories and notes for each show. And for those that are contributing $8 or more a month, you'll not only see that, but you'll see all of the links to all the stories I had to cut. So this week, we had an unusual number of stories. I had to cut 6 news stories because there was just so much news going on. But if you go out to the Patreon page and contribute, you can see all of the stories. Well, that does it for another show. Don't forget, if you are involved with Cirrus in any way, contact me if you need any help. I specialize in the Cirrus, especially if you're thinking about buying a new one or thinking of buying one that's slightly used. Contact me because I can help you with the analysis. There are a lot of factors there that aren't obvious when you're considering new or slightly used. So if you love the show, please tell your friends where to find this podcast. And until next week, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.